Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Gives me a great pleasure to rise today in this House to speak about my private member's bill, Bill C-378. And I stand in this House, Mr. Speaker, on behalf of the millions of men and women who have fought for our country, the 700,000 veterans in this country, and it's for them that I rise with respect to this bill. And I also rise, Mr. Speaker, with an understanding that the sacrifices that have been made by those men and women and their families throughout the course of Canadian history is what allows all of us that sit in our symbol of democracy the privilege to do so, Mr. Speaker. And I want to thank them. I want to thank their families. I want to thank their memory. And I hope by the time I'm done here today, Mr. Speaker, I will have done a good enough job to explain what this private member's bill is all about and ask for the support of this House for it. The principles that I'm looking to establish within the Department of Veterans Affairs Act are three basic principles. Number one, that the person, as well as their dependents or survivors, is to be treated with dignity, respect, and fairness. That the uniqueness of a person's professionalism and obligations and sacrifices such a profession demands also impacts the experiences of their family. And that any decision regarding the care, treatment, and reestablishment in civilian life of the person and the benefits to be provided to them be made in a timely manner. Mr. Speaker, it's in the spirit of Sir Robert Borden, who spoke to Canadian soldiers preparing for that great battle of Vimy Ridge, that C-378 is introduced. Our 8th Prime Minister said to the troops at the time, "You need have no fear that the government and the country will fail to show just appreciation of your service, and the government and the country will consider it their first duty to prove to returned men its just and due appreciation of the inestimable value of the services rendered to the country. That the government and the country will consider it their first duty to prove to return men its just and due appreciation of the inestimable value of the services rendered to the country." And that, Mr. Speaker, was worth repeating. Sir Robert Borden may have been the first to talk about an obligation and duty, but he's not been the last. Veterans and current members of the Canadian Armed Forces that I met with this summer have told me they wish to see these principles in place. And Mr. Speaker, over the summer, I had the opportunity to travel across the country to meet with veterans, to meet with their families, and to meet with stakeholders. And every single one of them that I met with talked about this sacred obligation, this covenant on behalf of the government and its servicemen and women. And when Sir Robert Borden spoke of that obligation to Canadian soldiers, there's never been an obligation to the men and women and their families enacted in Canadian legislation. And that's what I hope to change with Bill C-378. I must start as well, Mr. Speaker, by saying that this is not an indictment on any government. It's not an indictment on the current government. It's not an indictment on the valuable employees that work at Veterans Affairs Canada. This is about doing something that veterans have asked for. In the previous government, there was a Veterans Bill of Rights that was brought in 2007. The Veterans Bill of Rights, you have the right to take part in discussions that involve you and your family, have someone with you to support you when you deal with Veterans Affairs, to receive clear, easy-to-understand information about our programs and services in English and French, as set out in the Official Languages Act, and have your privacy protected as set out in the Privacy Act. More importantly, the Veterans Bill of Rights included two rights that are included as principles in C-378. One is to be treated with respect, dignity, fairness, and courtesy, and that the benefits and services as set out in our published service standards and to know your appeal rights. Mr. Speaker, Canada had the Veterans Bill of Rights, but it is the 2011 Armed Services Covenant from the United Kingdom and Prime Minister David Cameron that were the gold standard, that continues to be the gold standard set for stating a nation's obligation to its forces. The UK Armed Forces Covenant highlights include that they, the men and women and their families, deserve our respect and support and fair treatment. The whole nation, it says in that covenant, has a moral obligation to the members of the Naval Service, the Army, and the Royal Air Force, together with their families. They should face no disadvantage compared to other citizens in the provision of public and commercial services. And special consideration is appropriate in some cases, especially for those who have given most, such as the injured and the bereaved. It's also important to understand, Mr. Speaker, that the United Kingdom is the only country in this world that has a covenant with its servicemen and women. I am proud of C-378 and the principles our armed forces members and veterans are asking for. I'd like to take some time to go through the three principles. The first states that the person, as well as their dependents or survivors, is to be treated with dignity, respect, and fairness. This respect is duly earned as the men and women who defend our democracy essentially go to work in a theater of war where those they are battling do not recognize the rights and freedoms that Canadians expect to have. Canadians would not have those rights and freedoms without the efforts of our brave soldiers and the sacrifices they faced on the battlefields for the past 150 years. In the words of Aaron Bedard, a veteran and someone who I now consider a friend, he said to me about fairness, respect, and dignity, "I know that the principles of fairness, respect, and dignity towards Canadian veterans are as important to Canadians as they are for veterans and our families." And I believe that, Mr. Speaker, in all that I am. Sir Robert Borden first touched on the idea of an obligation because the duty performed by our Canadian forces. The second principle of C-378 states we should recognize the uniqueness of the person's professionalism and the obligations and sacrifices, such as that a profession demands that they also impact the experiences of their family. It's only in recent years where the duty of a soldier's family has been recognized. This recognition is long overdue. For far too many years, families along with veterans suffered in silence with what was at first called shell shock, and to now that we know as the unseen injury of post-traumatic stress disorder. And on that note, Mr. Speaker, the honourable member from Prince George Caribou had passed in this House Bill C-211. And I note that it's been 168 days since that bill has been in the Senate, and it's time that that bill be passed in the Senate. In many Veterans Affairs Committee meetings, it was the spouse or the family member that spoke out about their roles in keeping their father, their brother, their mother, or family, a sister, alive, returning from theaters of war. Bill C-378, if passed, will forever recognize the uniqueness and obligations of not only the veterans who fought, but the families of the soldiers and our veterans. Thirdly, and more importantly, is the third principle, that any decision regarding the care, treatment, or reestablishment in civil life of the person and the benefits to be provided to them be made in a timely manner. Many discussions in this House and in committee revolve around the care our veterans receive. In some cases, Veterans Affairs does well, and I commend the men and women who work for VAC across the offices in Canada, in call centres and in the Charlottetown headquarters for the work that they do. There must be a recognition that there are cases where gaps are located and the standard of service cannot be met, Mr. Speaker. The idea of a timely manner must be considered in all aspects of care received by our veterans when transitioning to civilian life. There is a standard of care, but there are way too many gaps that exist right now that cause delays, Mr. Speaker. We can do better, and we must do better. Dave Bona, and veterans and methylquin survivors, said it best. When a soldier comes home, all they ask for is to have the services and medical care they need available in a timely manner for themselves and their family. Having these reasonable principles in the Act will set in place the simple obligation that we ask for. The obligation that is asked for is the recognition of care when it's needed, not 6, 7, 10, or 12 months after it is asked for. The obligation of getting care to veterans is with Veterans Affairs Canada. Timely manner means not using an average to deliver service within 16 weeks, for example, but a realistic expectation to veterans and their families for the different care that is to be delivered in the varying circumstances. The principle of receiving care in a timely manner takes the idea of in a timely manner from being aspirational to being realistic and to being expected. It also puts it in legislation. As research improves how care is delivered, so should when that care is delivered. Mr. Speaker, last summer, as I said, I had an opportunity to travel the country. I traveled with a member from Yorkton Melville and Souris Moose Mountain, met with veterans and their families. I met with Robert Gagnon, a veteran walking across BC to help veterans suffering from PTSD. In Nova Scotia and New Brunswick, we talked with the women and men who ran the military family resource centers. I met with Medrick Cousineau, who has saved 99 lives by pairing up veterans with trained service dogs. And in Calgary, we learned the incredible story about how the police there are helping our homeless veterans. In Edmonton, we met with CAF members and veterans together, and in that meeting, a colonel helped one veteran get off the street after hearing his story at that round table. I give all credit for the 3 principles in C-378 to everyone we met this summer. It is the veterans and their families, the MFRC staff, the volunteers, and activists that helped get this bill to the House today. I hope that all members of this House will support this bill, get 3782 to committee, where more voices from more veterans and more of their families can be heard about these principles and to get these important principles into legislation. And finally, Mr. Speaker, as I close, I'll give the last words to Don Sorokin from Vancouver, BC. He's a lawyer. He wrote me and said that I welcome this bill to further recognize the military covenant. Throughout our history, Canadians have put life and limb on the line to serve Canada. The covenant is Canada's promise that in return for this service to protect our country and its democratic institutions, like the institution we're in today, those who serve and their dependents will be honored, respected, and looked after by a grateful nation. The implementation of this covenant should not be left to the whims of bureaucrats or the other pressing demands of the government of the day. And it's important to understand that this obligation is not just to be placed on this government, this minister, or the bureaucracy, Mr. Speaker. This covenant is placed for future generations of future governments, future ministers, future bureaucrats, and future parliamentarians who understand the sacred obligation, that covenant that Canada should have, needs to have, and hopefully will have with its veterans. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.